Denise stared at the flickering basement lights of the steel yard, her shoulder throbbing from a blow that had nearly cracked the bone. In front of her, the man she had shared a bed with for 10 years sat paralyzed, his eyes fixed on a single sheet of paper that had effectively erased their existence. It wasn't just the $5,000 or the house title. Miller, the foreman, leaned over the table with a predatory grin, tapping a fresh signature that turned Denise's husband into a ghost. "You don't get it, Denise," Miller whispered, the smell of cheap cigars and ozone filling the cramped room. "He didn't just lose the money. He just signed over the next 5 years of his life, and yours to me." Outside, the summer storm broke, thunder rattling the industrial lockers like a cage. But the real roar was the silence coming from Marcus. He wouldn't look at her, not even when the debt collectors moved to block the only exit. Denise gripped a heavy, grease-stained wrench in her trembling hand, her mind racing through the mill's safety protocols for a way out that didn't involve a body bag. She had come here to save their home, but as the foreman reached for her wedding ring to settle the interest, she realized the game hadn't been about cards at all. It was a harvest, and they were the crop. The only question left was how many lives Marcus had actually destroyed before she arrived. The mill's final whistle shrieked through the cavernous space, a sound that always made Denise's teeth ache. She wiped her palms on her thighs, smearing fresh grease into the fabric of her coveralls, and reached for the time card. The punch clock's metal arm clanged against the slot, the sharp thunk echoing off the concrete walls. Her fingers trembled, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what waited outside. The mechanical ritual felt heavier tonight, the grease under her fingernails seemingly permanent. A black map of a 12-hour shift that had ground her bones into a fine powder. She watched the line of workers shuffle past, faces gray and anonymous under the flickering yellow sodium lights, each of them a ghost in a machine that never stopped hungry. The parking lot reeked of diesel and wet asphalt, the air thick enough to taste. Denise fished her phone from her pocket. The screen cracked at the corner from last week's fall. The bank app loaded slow, each second stretching like taffy. Then, the numbers appeared. So, Ruf. Her breath hitched. She tapped the screen again, as if the digits might rearrange themselves. The balance didn't budge. The $5,000, the property tax money, the just-in-case money she had hoarded like a squirrel against a winter that was always coming, was gone. Her stomach did a slow, nauseating roll. She leaned against the rusted fender of her sedan, the cold metal biting through her thin shirt. Her thumb scrolled through the transaction history with a frantic, jerky motion. The screen glowed like a radioactive eye in the gloom. Withdrawal, 400, withdrawal, 600, withdrawal, 500. All of them time-stamped within the last 48 hours. All of them traced back to a single location. A generic ATM ID that Denise recognized with a sinking, hollow dread. The Iron Ember. It was a dive bar 3 miles from the mill, a place where the beer was cheap and the secrets were expensive. Panic flickered in her chest, a hot, sharp flame that licked at her ribs. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a bank error. This was Marcus. The engine of her car groaned as she turned the key, a protest against the long day. But Denise didn't hear it. She steered the vehicle out of the gravel lot, tires spitting stones against the chain-link fence. Home was 3 miles south, a warm bed and the quiet breathing of her children. But she turned north. Every muscle in her legs screamed for rest. The lactic acid burning like lye, yet her grip on the steering wheel was iron. The streetlights of the industrial district blurred into long, smeary lines of amber. She couldn't go home. not while the ghost of their life was being liquidated in $20 increments. The iron embers sat on a corner where the sidewalk ended and the industrial wasteland began. Its neon sign hummed with a sick, rhythmic buzz, casting a jagged red glow over the cracked pavement. Denise pulled into the lot, her eyes scanning the shadows. Near the back exit, where the trash bins spilled over with glass and rot, she saw a familiar silhouette. It was Leo, Marcus's younger brother, a man who moved like a rat in a maze. He was slipping out the heavy steel door, glancing over his shoulder with a twitchy, nervous energy. In his hand, he clutched a thick roll of currency, the green of the bills visible even in the dim light. Denise didn't think. She threw the car into park and was out before the engine had fully died. She moved across the asphalt with the predatory grace of someone who had spent 20 years dodging heavy machinery. Leo saw her too late. He tried to pivot, his boots skidding on a patch of oil, but Denise was already there, cutting off his path to the alley. The air between them smelled of stale hops and desperation. Leo's face went pale, his small, beady eyes darting toward the darkness of the industrial dumpsters. He tucked the cash into his jacket, but the bulge remained, a guilty heart beating against his ribs. "Give it here, Leo," Denise rasped, her voice sounding like gravel grinding in a mixer. She didn't wait for an answer. When he tried to shove past her, she lunged. They collided against the side of a rusted dumpster, the impact ringing out like a funeral bell. Leo was wiry, but Denise had the weight of a decade of steel-toed boots and heavy lifting behind her. She reached into her work belt and pulled out her industrial maglite, a heavy, black cylinder of aircraft-grade aluminum. She didn't swing it. She used it as a lever, pinning his forearm against the metal bin until he cried out, the sound muffled by the roar of a passing freight train. "I don't know what you're talking about, D. Let go!" Leo squealed, his voice climbing an octave. Denise pressed harder, the flashlight digging into the soft tissue of his wrist. She leaned in close, so close she could smell the cheap cologne and the sour tang of sweat on him. "The bank account is empty, Leo. 5 grand. And you're walking out of here with a roll fat enough to choke a horse." She shoved the flashlight under his chin, forcing his head back against the cold steel. "Tell me where he is. Tell me what he's doing, or I swear to God, I'll take the price out of your hide right here." Leo's bravado crumbled like wet cardboard. He began to shake, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. "It ain't me, Denise. I'm just the runner. Marcus, he's in deep. He's in the basement." The words tumbled out, a confession born of pure, unadulterated fear. He's lost the savings, all of it. He thought he could double it, thought he had a streak going, but the cards, they aren't falling his way. He's betting everything now. Everything. The weight of the words hit Denise like a physical blow, a cold stone settling in her gut. Who's he playing, Leo? Who takes $5,000 from a man with 2 kids and a mortgage? Her voice was a whisper now, more dangerous than a scream. Leo swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against the flashlight. "It's Miller, D., the foreman." The name sent a chill down her spine. Miller. The man who signed her paychecks, the man who patrolled the mill floor like a god of rust and iron. He wasn't just their boss. He was the shadow that loomed over every worker in the district. "Miller doesn't just play cards," Leo continued, his voice hushed and hurried. "He's the bank. He gives the loans when the mill cuts the hours. He sets the interest. He's got half the floor in his pocket, paying back juice on money they never should have touched. Marcus, he thought he was smarter, thought he could beat the man who owns the table." Leo looked at her with a flicker of genuine pity, a look that made Denise want to vomit. The reality of the trap crystallized in her mind. This wasn't just a bad night at the tables. It was a systematic dismantling of their lives. Miller didn't want the $5,000. Not really. He wanted the leverage. He wanted employees who couldn't quit, who couldn't complain about safety violations or docked pay because they were shackled to him by debt. Marcus hadn't just lost their money. He had handed Miller the leash. Denise stood there in the dark, the neon red of the bar sign bleeding into the puddles at her feet, and realized that her husband wasn't a victim of luck. He was a piece of inventory. As she pulled away from the bar, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. It was a text, the notification light blinking like a warning flare. She swiped it open at a red light. Notice of default, 1422. Maple Saint property flagged for public auction, 24 hours to cure. The words were cold, bureaucratic, and final. The property taxes hadn't been paid. The bank had moved with the ruthless efficiency of a shark. She had one day before the only roof her children had ever known was sold to the highest bidder on the courthouse steps. The house was dark when she pulled into the driveway, the beige siding looking gray and sickly under the moon. She stormed inside, calling Marcus's name, her voice echoing off the cheap wood paneling. "Marcus, get out here." Silence answered her. She checked the kitchen, the bedroom, even the cramped bathroom. Nothing. On the kitchen table, next to a pile of unopened bills, sat a scrap of paper. "Taking the double shift at the yard. Need the overtime. Love you." It was a lie, written in his looping, careless script. He wasn't working. He was at the mill, but he wasn't on the clock. She walked back outside, her mind racing, and stopped at the car. Something looked wrong. The rear of the sedan was sagging, the bumper nearly touching the gravel. She popped the trunk and stared into the empty well where the spare tire should have been. The jack was gone. The lug wrench was gone. Even the small emergency kit her father had given her was missing. Marcus hadn't just taken the cash. He was scavenging the very tools of their survival. He was selling their safety for one more hand, one more chance to prove he wasn't the failure he felt like every time he looked at her. A crumpled slip of paper caught her eye, snagged on a piece of trunk liner. She smoothed it out. A receipt from Quick Cash Pawn. Date, today. Time, 4:15 p.m. Item, hydraulic jack, spare tire, socket set. Amount, $85. He had stripped their car for the price of a single buy-in. The desperation of it was a physical weight, a suffocating heat that made the night air feel thin. He was drowning, and instead of reaching for her hand, he was pulling the whole family under with him to use as a float. The sound of a heavy engine interrupted her thoughts. A black SUV, windows tinted dark as ink, pulled into the driveway, blocking her in. Two men got out. They weren't from the neighborhood. They wore cheap suits that struggled to contain shoulders built from years of violence. Vince and Dale. Miller's shadows. They didn't look like debt collectors. They looked like the end of a story. They walked toward her with a slow, synchronized gait that told her they had done this 1,000 times before. "Where's the man of the house, Denise?" The wiry one, Dale asked. He had a gold tooth that glinted when he smiled, a gesture that never reached his cold, frantic eyes. "He's missed a few appointments. Miller's starting to think he's being avoided. And nobody avoids Miller. He's not here," Denise said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And I don't have your money. You can see the house, you can see the car. There's nothing left to take." Vince, the mountain of a man who hadn't spoken, stepped closer. He smelled of menthol and old leather. "We heard there was a savings account. Tax money. Marcus said it was coming our way tonight." He reached out, his hand toward the door handle of the house. Maybe we should go inside. See if he's hiding under the bed. Get off my porch. Denise snapped, her hand sliding toward the kitchen door behind her. Or what? Dale laughed, a sharp, barking sound. You're gonna call the cops? Tell 'em your husband gambled away the mortgage? I don't think so. He moved to push past her, his hand reaching for the screen door. Denise's fingers found the handle of the cast-iron skillet she'd left on the counter to dry. It was heavy, seasoned by years of use, a solid 3 pounds of black iron. As Dale's hand touched the glass of the door, she didn't scream. She didn't warn him. She swung. The skillet caught him square in the chest, the sound of metal hitting bone, a dull, sickening thud. Dale wheezed, the air leaving his lungs in a frantic rush, and tumbled backward off the porch steps, landing hard in the dirt. Vince froze, his eyes widening. Denise stood in the doorway, the skillet held low, her knuckles white. I said, get off my property. I don't have his debts, and I don't have his lies. If you want Marcus, go find him at the yard. But if you step on this grass again, I'll do more than bruise your ribs. She was shaking, but her voice was a steel beam. For a long, agonizing second, Vince looked like he might lung. Then he looked at Dale, who was gasping for air on the ground, and back at the woman with the iron in her hand. They retreated, dragging the bruised Dale back to the SUV. This doesn't go away, Denise. Dale managed to choke out as the door slammed. Miller's coming for the deed. It's already signed. The SUV roared out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of burnt rubber. Denise leaned against the doorframe, the skillet slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. The deed. She ran to Marcus's small, cluttered desk in the corner of the living room, tearing through drawers until she found a blue folder hidden behind a stack of old tax returns. Inside was a single sheet of legal bond paper. It was a private contract, dated 3 days ago. Collateral agreement. In Marcus's messy hand, he had pledged the equity of their home against a temporary credit line of $10,000. He hadn't just lost the savings, he had bet the dirt they stood on. And the final game, the settlement, as the contract called it, was happening tonight. At the mill. In the basement locker room where the union reps never ventured. She looked at the clock. 11:45 p.m. The shift change happened at midnight. That was when the yard was at its quietest, the transition between the exhausted and the arriving. She grabbed her work jacket, the one with the mill's logo faded on the pocket, and her heavy boots. She didn't have a plan, only a destination. She had to stop him. She had to rip that paper out of Miller's manicured hands before the sun rose on a house that no longer belonged to her children. The drive to the U.S. Steel Yard was a descent into a mechanical purgatory. A summer storm had broken, the rain coming down in thick, vertical sheets that turned the sky a bruised, sickly orange from the reflected glow of the blast furnaces. The roads were slick with oil and runoff, the car hydroplaning as she took the corners too fast. The mill loomed ahead, a skeletal titan of rusted pipes and screaming steam, its silhouette etched against the lightning-lit clouds. It looked less like a workplace and more like a tomb. She bypassed the main gate, sliding the car into a dark patch of weeds near the old rail spur. She knew the gaps in the fence, the places where the chain link had rusted through from the river salt. She slipped through, the rain soaking her to the bone in seconds. The yard was a labyrinth of shadow and noise, the rhythmic thrum-thrum of the heavy presses, the hiss of cooling vats, the distant shout of a foreman. She moved with a ghost's precision, staying low behind the piles of slag and the rows of dormant freight cars. The basement locker room was located under the old No. 4 mill, a place that had been condemned for air quality issues years ago. The door was a heavy slab of iron, tucked behind a maze of steam pipes. Denise paused, her hand on the cold metal. She could hear voices, muffled, low, punctuated by the sharp clack of plastic chips. She took a breath that tasted of ozone and grease, pushed the door open, and stepped into the heat. The room was thick with the smell of sweat and cheap cigars. A single bare bulb hung over a makeshift table. A sheet of plywood balanced on two tool chests. Marcus was there. He looked like a man who had died and forgotten to lie down. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a mask of gray skin and stubble. Across from him sat Miller, looking impossibly clean in a charcoal suit, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were still corded with muscle. There were others, men from the night shift, their faces grim, watching the spectacle of a man's slow suicide. Denise stayed in the shadows by the rusted lockers, her presence unnoticed in the tension of the hand. On the table sat a mountain of chips and crumpled bills. Marcus was staring at his cards, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. "I'm in," he whispered, his voice a dry husk. He pushed his remaining stack into the center. It was the pot of a lifetime. If he won, the savings were back. The house was safe. The debt was gone. Denise held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The dealer, a man Denise recognized as a floor lead named Frank, flipped the final card. A king of hearts. Marcus let out a ragged, sobbing breath and turned his cards over. A full house. He reached out, his fingers trembling, to rake in the pile. For a spectacular, shimmering second, the world righted itself. Denise felt a surge of hope so sharp it hurt. They were okay. They could go home. They could fix this. "Hold on," Miller said. The voice was quiet, a low vibration that cut through the room's heat. He didn't move his hands. He just stared at Marcus with those pale, ice-crack eyes. "Frank, check the deck." The dealer paused, his hand hovering over the discarded pile. He pulled out a card, another king of hearts. "Cheating, Marcus?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with a mock, icy disappointment. "In my game? After everything I've done for you?" "I didn't. I don't know how that got there," Marcus shrieked, jumping to his feet. The chair flipped over, clattering against the concrete. "The pot is forfeit," Miller announced, his voice rising just enough to command the room. "And there's a penalty for thieves." The room exploded. Two men from the shadows lunged at Marcus, their fists swinging with the practiced cruelty of the desperate. The table was overturned, chips scattering like plastic hail, money fluttering into the grease-stained puddles on the floor. Marcus went down under a hail of boots and knuckles, his cries lost in the roar of the men. Denise didn't think about the odds. She didn't think about the danger. She saw the man she had loved for 20 years being broken on a locker room floor. And she moved. She dove into the fray, her heavy work boots finding purchase on a man's shin, her flashlight swinging in a blinding arc. She threw herself over Marcus, shielding his head with her arms. A heavy boot caught her in the shoulder, a white-hot flash of pain radiating down her spine. But she didn't move. "Stop it! Stop!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the low ceiling. The violence sputtered out, the men backing away as Miller stepped forward. He looked down at them with a smirk that was all teeth. "Denise, I wondered when the backbone of the family would show up." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The deed. Next to it, he laid out another document, fresh and crisp. "He lost the card 10 minutes before you walked in, Denise," Miller said, his voice smooth as oil. "And this? This is his new employment contract. 5 years of his wages, garnished at the source to cover the interest on his infractions tonight. He's mine now. You both are. Denise looked at the paper, then at the bruised, weeping man in her arms. The winning hand had been a setup. Miller had planted the card, waited for the hope to peak, and then crushed it to ensure he had the ultimate leverage. He didn't want the money. He wanted the souls. He wanted a workforce that couldn't breathe without his permission. Miller laughed then, a dry, rattling sound that filled the humid room. He looked at Denise's grease-stained coveralls, her cracked fingernails, the gray hair escaping her bun. "Look at you," he mocked. "The great Denise Caldwell. You'll be scrubbing my floors and running my presses until your heart stops, just to keep a roof over this pathetic wreck of a man. You're nothing but a gear in my machine." Denise looked up at him. The despair was there, a cold, dark ocean. But beneath it, something else was stirring. A heat, a pressure. She looked past Miller's shoulder, her eyes catching the red glow of the emergency fire suppression panel on the wall. She knew this room. She knew the pipes that ran above it. She knew that the basement locker room sat directly under the high-pressure steam manifold for the number 4 furnace. "You're right, Miller," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "I am a gear, and you forgot what happens when a gear catches a sleeve." She moved with a sudden, violent burst of energy. She didn't go for Miller. She lunged for the fire suppression panel, her heavy flashlight smashing the glass with a crystalline spray. She didn't pull the alarm. She hit the manual override for the steam release valves. The world turned into a white, screaming nightmare. A deafening roar filled the space as the safety valves groaned and gave way. Thick, scalding clouds of white vapor hissed into the room from the overhead vents, turning the air into a blinding fog in seconds. The temperature spiked, the moisture clinging to skin and clothes. Men screamed, stumbling blindly into lockers and each other. Miller's voice rose in a frantic, confused shout, lost in the mechanical shriek of the release. Denise didn't need to see. She knew the layout by heart. She stayed low, where the air was cooler, and crawled toward the desk where Miller had been sitting. Her fingers found the edge of the plywood, then the smooth, cold surface of the metal tool chest. She swept her hand across the top, her heart leaping as her fingers brushed against paper. She grabbed the folder, the deed, and the keys to the SUV that Miller had left on the corner of the table. A hand caught her wrist, a strong, manicured grip. Miller. He was coughing, his eyes streaming from the heat, but he had found her. "Give them back," he wheezed, his face a distorted mask in the mist. Denise didn't hesitate. She brought the heavy maglite down on his wrist with every ounce of rage she had stored over 20 years of 12-hour shifts. There was a sharp crack, a howl of pain, and the grip vanished. She scrambled back, grabbing Marcus by the collar of his shirt. "Get up!" she hissed into his ear. "Move, or we die here." She dragged him through the blinding white, her hand trailing along the rusted pipes as a guide. They burst through the iron door and into the main corridor, just as the night shift crew was beginning to gather for the midnight change. Dozens of men, their faces smudged with soot, stared in shock as the two of them emerged from the screaming steam, Denise clutching the evidence of their enslavement to her chest. "Frank, Javier," Denise shouted, her voice cutting through the confusion. She saw the union reps, their eyes wide as they recognized her. She didn't stop. She didn't hide. She threw the folder onto the floor at their feet, the papers spilling out, the private loans, the predatory contracts, the illegal deed transfers. "Miller's running a sharking ring in the locker room," she cried, pointing back toward the billowing steam. "He's been baiting the men into debt and stealing their wages. Look at the papers. Look at what he did to Marcus." The atmosphere in the corridor shifted. It wasn't just shock anymore. It was a slow, bubbling heat. These were men who had all felt the squeeze, who had all wondered why their overtime never seemed to add up, why Miller always seemed to know exactly how much they owed the bank. They looked at the broken, bleeding Marcus, then at the woman who had stood her ground in the heart of the machine. Miller stumbled out of the steam then, his suit ruined, his face beet red and peeling. "They're thieves," he shrieked, pointing at Denise. "They attacked me. Call security." But the union reps didn't move toward Denise. Frank, the older man with the gnarled hands, picked up the employment contract and read it slowly. His face went hard, a mask of cold, industrial fury. He looked at Miller, then at the night shift crew gathering behind him. "This ain't a contract, Miller," Frank said, his voice a low rumble. "This is a bill of sale, and we don't sell people in this yard." The circle closed in around Miller. There was no shouting, no frantic violence, just the heavy, inevitable weight of 60 men who had found the source of their pain. As the night foreman and the security team arrived, Denise didn't wait to see the end. She knew Miller was done. The mill would protect its own, but it wouldn't protect a man who had turned the machinery against the workers. Outside, the rain had turned into a soft, cooling drizzle. Marcus collapsed against the side of their car, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a jagged, ugly sobbing. "I'm sorry, Dee," he moaned. He said if I didn't pay, he'd tell everyone about the accident, about Ricky. He said he had the logs I changed. Denise stopped, her hand on the car door. The accident. 5 years ago. The forklift. She looked at her husband, the man she had fought for, the man who had almost cost them their lives. The gambling hadn't been a choice. It had been a prison built on a single moment of cowardice. Miller hadn't just used money. He had used the truth. "The logs are gone, Marcus," she said, her voice flat. "I took everything from his desk. The files, the notes, all of it." She looked at the papers in her hand, the ink blurring in the rain. She didn't feel relief. She felt a cold, hard clarity. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, legal pad page she had prepared. "Sign this." Marcus looked up, his eyes red and hollow. "What is it?" "It's a power of attorney and a trust agreement. From now on, your checks go to me. You don't touch a cent of the household money. You go to the meetings, you do the work, and I handle the rest. If you ever step foot near a card table again, I'll hand those accident logs to the police myself." Marcus looked at her, and for the first time, he saw her. Not the tired wife, not the gear in the machine, but the storm that had broken Miller. He signed the paper with a trembling hand. Monday morning, the whistle shrieked through the cavernous space, a sound that made Denise's teeth ache. She wiped her palms on her thighs, reached for the time card, and punched in. The mill was the same. The grease, the heat, the constant, hungry roar. But as she took her place on the line, watching the molten steel flow in a river of fire, her spine was straight. The house was hers. The future was hers. She wasn't holding on anymore. She was the one holding the wheel.